Welcome to Who's That Pokemon, the only twice-weekly Pokemon anime rewatch podcast on the entire internet. If you didn't know, this is a retrospective look back on the Pokemon anime series, episode by episode from the very beginning. This show has been airing for over 20 years now and has over 1,000 episodes, yet somehow it actually kind of gets neglected by Pokemon fans, so I thought to myself, it's time that a podcast was solely dedicated to the Pokemon anime. Each Wednesday and Sunday you can tune in on YouTube and podcast services everywhere to hear an episode breakdown. Obviously, because this is the very first episode of the podcast, we're going to be reviewing the very first episode of the series, Pokemon I Choose You. During the first season, most episode titles were literal translations from the Japanese title. However, as the series progressed, 4Kids would move away from this and they kind of lean more heavily on puns and references for their episode titles. It's the first episode of this season and the first episode of the show overall, but most people don't realise that it wasn't even the first episode to be shown to Western audiences. That honour actually goes to Battle Aboard the St. Anne. It was shown as a sneak peek preview of the Pokemon series, kind of to get people hyped up about the impending season that was coming, because at this time, the games hadn't been released yet, and Pokemon was still a relatively unknown entity in the West, basically anywhere outside of Japan. So they kind of did this to try and give it a little bit of a leg up before it aired the first episode. However, this sneak peek actually wasn't even shown everywhere because many areas were running the annual Labor Day Jerry Lewis MDA telethon instead. So it kind of backfired. It didn't go off the way they wanted it to, and yeah, it probably fell flat in most cases. However, I feel like showing Battle Aboard the St. Anne as a sneak preview is a pretty smart decision. It's a much more action-packed episode than Pokemon I Choose You, I believe. And I think Battle Aboard the St. Anne's actually remembered pretty fondly by fans. So them plucking this out of the first season and being like, yeah, we should do this episode as a sneak peek, was actually pretty good foresight by whoever was in charge of deciding that. I guess maybe 4Kids would have been deciding that. I'm not really too sure who would have been in charge of being like, yep, we need a sneak peek of this. But yeah, whoever chose Battle Aboard the St. Anne, I think it was a pretty good idea to, which I just think it works well as a sort of teaser before introducing the series properly. So, the first episode of the Pokemon anime first aired in Japan on April 1st, 1997. No, it wasn't an April Fool's joke. It would continue to air for another 20 years. It would also air in the United States on September 8, 1998. As you could imagine, this is the longest time between Japanese premiere and American premiere at 525 days. However, it's actually the second longest if you include the controversial Beauty and the Beach episode, which was initially banned because it showed James with fake breasts, and it was kind of, just overall it's kind of a risque episode. 1,061 days after the Japanese airing, it actually aired on Cartoon Network, I believe. It was heavily censored. I think they edited it down to about like 18 minutes or so, maybe even 17 minutes, which is considerably less. And Pokemon episodes are usually around the 21-minute mark. So yeah, it's a considerable hack job for it. And, I don't really count it because it's kind of a weird, unique case. The first episode's really, you can't really count the first episode as being the longest in between because that was probably always going to be it. But yeah, so those are really the two contenders for longest between American premiere and Japanese premiere. I want to kind of, for each air date, go through what was happening in Pokemon history, but unfortunately on both of these air dates, April 1st and September 8th, nothing's happened of really note in Pokemon history. Nothing other than a few random episodes debuting that aren't that notable. But with that out of the way, we move on to the debuts in this episode. And as this was the first episode of the show, there were obviously loads of characters, both human and Pokemon, that make their debut here. For the human debuts, we have Ash Ketchum, Misty, Professor Oak, Gary Oak, Delia Ketchum, and Gary Oak's cheerleaders. The Pokemon debuts, similarly, there is quite a few. We have Nidorino, Gengar, Onix, Bulbasaur, Squirtle, and Charmander. However, they don't appear properly. They appear in a dream, so they kind of haven't really debuted properly yet. We also have Dodrio, Pikachu, Pidgey, Rattata, Spearow, Sandshrew, Mankey, Magikarp, Gyarados, and Ho-Oh right at the end. And of course, this show is named after it, so we're obviously going to go over what the Who's That Pokemon is for this episode. And unsurprisingly, the first ever Who's That Pokemon is Pikachu. Of course, they're going to kick it off. Pikachu is the star Pokemon of this episode, and he's the Pokemon main character in the show. So it's little wonder that the Who's That Pokemon was Pikachu. But with all of the episode info out of the way, it's time to jump into the actual episode summary and discussion. So before we actually kind of kick off the episode proper, I just want to talk about the opening for the anime in the first season, because I don't know when else I would talk about it, so it's probably best to talk about it with the debut. Just, can we appreciate how freaking good this opening was? I know it's such a cliche thing to kind of drool over basically everything in Generation 1, but particularly the anime is remembered so fondly, and there's so much nostalgia for this show, and everybody always talks about, it's the best, and I don't necessarily always agree, but when it comes to the discussion around the intro here, it's just so good. It's impossible to understate how kind of epic it is. Seeing this as a kid, it just got you so hyped. I mean, it kicks off with fucking Mewtwo. It's just so... the hype gets you. You just want to go out and train Pokemon. So I think they really nailed the opener. It's such a strong hook for kids. Like, you got this dope intro and you're like, hell yeah, I want to go and watch this show right now. But yeah, I wanted to give a bit of love to that before we moved into the actual episode. As always, our episode summary is brought to you by Bulbapedia, one of the best Pokemon sites. I'll go on the limb and say the best Pokemon site on the entire internet. And I grabbed my summaries from there, so I thought I should give them a shout out for all the great work they do. So let's jump into the actual episode itself here. We kick things off in a massive stadium. Two creatures known as Pokemon are having a battle here. One of the Pokemon, a Gengar, uses its Hypnosis attack on its opponent, a Nidorino. This causes it to fall asleep. The Nidorino's trainer recalls it and sends out another Pokemon, Onix, into battle. The massive Rock Snake Pokemon emerges from its Pokeball and prepares to take on Gengar, at which point it is revealed that the battle is actually being displayed on a television.
Oh, it's Onix! Now this giant Pokemon's on the attack! Oh, but Gengar jumps aside!
I just love so much that they decided to start the series off with the opening cinematic from the games, and they even start the show off using the same style as the games. The opening intro to the games, it literally looks pretty much identical to it, and then it morphs into the epic battle that we see there. It's so cool. I wouldn't really think this kind of fan service would be being paid to the series in episode 1. I would kind of associate something like a nod to the games in such a way like this as something that would come later down the line when Pokemon is more established and, the cult of it and the fandom has grown heaps. But, I mean, it's been just over a year since the games debuted in Japan. So the fandom has grown there, and there's obviously a lot of Pokemon fans at this point in time. But I wouldn't have thought that the creators would be like, you know what, this we should kick it off the same way that the games kick off. We'll have the same intro cinematic, and we'll even have it in the same style and have it transition into our style, which is just, it's so cool. I love that they did that. The trainer here also, one of them, the Onix trainer, resembles Bruno from the Elite Four. And while Bruno doesn't actually have a Nidorino, I feel like the only reason a Nidorino is in this battle is because they wanted to do that fan service to the games. Otherwise, if they had have just kind of stuck with their idea, I feel like they're implying that this is a Elite Four battle. It just looks so much like Bruno that it's gotta be a nod in that direction, and I think the Onyx kind of confirms that. And it's just kind of cool that Ash is sort of watching an Elite Four battle before he starts off in his journey. And just overall, I really love seeing these league battles taking place in huge stadiums. Something about it has just always struck me as so cool. Even when I was a kid, I'm just like, this is so crazy. I guess it kind of played on my wish as a kid to be like, damn, I wish Pokemon was real. I wish I could go on this journey. I wish I could, train, become amazing, and then just, battle in front of hundreds, thousands of people in the stadium. That was the ultimate dream as a kid. And, I feel like they really capture it quite well here. As a kid watching this, I felt like Ash. So yeah, I think the way that the episode kicks off is just so... It's perfect in my eyes. So after we pull out from the TV and see that somebody's watching it, it's revealed to us that it is a boy named Ash Ketchum who lives in a small town by the name of Pallet, and he's 10 years old, which is going to allow him to pick a starter Pokemon and become a Pokemon trainer the very next day. Ash declares to himself and the Pokemon of the world that he will become a Pokemon master. His speech, however, is interrupted by his mother, who tells him to go to bed as he has a pretty big day tomorrow. Ash protests and says that he's too excited to sleep, so his mum says, you know what, if you're not going to sleep, then why don't you at least prepare for tomorrow? She flicks on a program from the town's Pokemon expert, which happens to be Professor Oak. Ash watches as Professor Oak explains that new trainers get to pick one of 3 Pokemon to start their journey: the Grass-type Bulbasaur, the Fire-type Charmander, or the Water-type Squirtle. So this is really where we first get to see... Well, this is where we get to see Ash speak for the first time. And I think his voice is really feminine at this point. And it goes for the first few episodes. I can't remember off the top of my head where the change happens, but I feel like it's pretty noticeable. And these early episodes really are pretty much Veronica Taylor trying to nail down that voice. She's still working through it. She hasn't kind of come to the iconic voice that we would all know and love, and that many fans would be extremely mad about when she would get replaced in quite a few years' time. So yeah, it's a little bit rough to listen to these early episodes, and you kind of have to remind yourself, like, yeah, well, the voice actor has only just started on this job. They're still finding their footing, and voice acting that kind of applies to every show's first season. I feel like it's pretty rare that you see a voice actor nail a voice in the first season, let alone the first few episodes. So Ash heads off to sleep, and as he sleeps, he goes over the choices in his head for his starter Pokemon, and kind of pointing out the reasons why any 3 of the available Pokemon would be good for a starting trainer. However, his Voltorb alarm clock rolls into his hand while he's sleeping, and he dreams that he's throwing a Pokeball. This results in him throwing the alarm into the wall and smashing it. When Ash finally wakes up the next day, he sees that the sun is high in the sky and realizes he's overslept. Ash runs to the lab, and he's in such a hurry, he doesn't change out of his pajamas, and at this point, he really doesn't care which starter he's going to get, as long as he just gets one. He arrives at the lab just in time to see one of his new fellow trainers and Professor Oak's grandson, Gary Oak, leaving. Unfortunately for Ash, Gary is very overconfident and brags that he was on time and already has his first Pokemon, so he's already ahead of Ash, but he refuses to reveal which one he got, and we're actually not going to find out which Pokemon Gary has for a very long time. So Gary has a large crowd here to support him, which includes his group of cheerleaders that we will see off and on throughout the series. And they're all cheering for him, and Gary promises that he's going to become a Pokemon Master and be the one to put Pallet Town on the map before he heads off on his journey.
Well, Ash, you snooze, you lose, and you're way behind right from the start. I've got a Pokemon, and you don't.
You got your first Pokemon?
That's right, loser, and it's right inside this Pokeball.
So I always found it weird here that Gary addresses Ash as if he's never met him before, as if he's just like, oh, who's this weird kid that is obviously here to get a Pokemon, but he's still in his pajamas, he's overslept, what a dweeb. But all the other context we receive throughout the series is that they've known each other for ages, so I feel like they kind of weren't sure whether they would go for, they don't know each other, or whether they've kind of grown up together, which Pallet Town is always, even in the show, it's depicted as a small kind of country town, and you would think that two kids, both the same age, would know each other. Like, logically, there's probably not that many kids to play with, so even if you don't like each other, you're probably going to run into each other just on the basis of you being in the same age, and there's not a very large pool of people to kind of hang out with. So I always thought that was kind of weird, but again, it's kind of a byproduct of this being the very first episode and the writers not really having a definitive idea yet of what everything they wanted to be. As we move on here, the crowd follows Gary, and Ash is left all by himself, but not for long as Professor Oak approaches him. Ash apologizes for being late and not dressed for the occasion, but tells Professor Oak he's ready to pick his first Pokemon. He gets taken into the lab, and Ash sees 3 Pokeballs sitting on a pedestal and states that after thinking about it, he's decided to choose Squirtle as his starter. However, the Pokeball, as we find out, is empty. Oak explains that Squirtle has already been claimed by a trainer that was on time, and Ash doesn't mind as he decides to instead go with Bulbasaur, who has already been taken as well. Ash is kind of dejected, but he's still happy to go with Charmander. But alas, that Pokemon is gone too, with someone who wasn't late. I always found it a little bit weird that Oak only had 3 starter Pokemon. With the events of Celebi Voice of the Forest, they kind of retcon this as, the whole time travel plot. Oak finds out that Ash starts off with a Pokemon, so you kind of have that loop where, like, Oak finds out that Ash has a Pikachu, so he goes there and he can kind of, make that happen. But before that, I think most people kind of felt that Oak was bad at his job. Like, I don't know, like, why would you only have 3? Surely he knew how many people were coming to get a starter Pokemon, or like, even if you didn't know how many people were coming to get a starter Pokemon, surely you would have backup options. Like, what if one year, it just so happened that, 5 sets of parents had kids, and in 10 years' time, there's 5 kids who need starter Pokemon. What, are 2 of them going to miss out? Like, it's one of those moments where you kind of just, you have to not think too hard about it, otherwise it just doesn't make sense. It's a bit of Pokemon logic. We can also assume from this scene that if Ash had his way, he would have chosen Squirtle as his starter, which coincidentally, it's actually Gary's starter. We don't find that out until, I'm pretty sure we don't see his Blastoise until the Silver Conference, which is so long. That's such a huge build-up. I'm not entirely sure why they waited that long. Maybe they wanted it to be epic when you finally see his starter and it's the final form. But yeah, it was always seemed a little weird that we, never see Gary's starter. But it's also cool that if, unknowingly Ash had the same line of thinking with Gary, which at the time that would have annoyed Ash to no end, I can imagine. So throughout these summaries and discussions, I want to filter in trivia and errors and kind of changes that the dub made from the original. And we've come to our first error in the series and of the episode. If all 3 starters had already been taken, then the Pokeballs containing those Pokemon should theoretically be with the trainers, as Gary has a Pokeball for his starter, and it doesn't make sense that those Pokeballs are still there. It kind of just seems like Oak is fucking with Ash, because you could kind of headcanon it away by saying, oh well, Oak caught them in that Pokeball and he had to like release them and then put them into another ball for the trainer or something. But it's just a lot of mental gymnastics that has to go into it. It really just doesn't make sense, and the Pokeballs are really there for the visual and to kind of serve the plot purpose of Ash opening the ball and finding out that, well, there's nothing in it. Moving on here, Ash asks if this means there are no Pokemon left for him. And Oak tells him that it isn't exactly true that there's no Pokemon left, because he does have another Pokemon, but it's rather unusual. At this point, Ash is basically willing to settle for anything that Oak gives him, and he says that he'll take it no matter what. A 4th Pokeball emerges onto the pedestal, and Ash picks it up. upon which point it opens and from it emerges a small yellow mouse-like Pokemon. Oak explains that the Pokemon is named Pikachu, and Ash is very impressed with it, deciding that Pikachu is way better than any of the previous starters.
Pikachu.
Its name is Pikachu.
Oh, it's so cute. It's the best of all.
First bit of trivia for the episode. This is actually the only episode where Ash's Pikachu is seen inside its Pokeball. We see Pikachu come out of a Pokeball. I think, from memory, he comes out of the Mewtwo ball that's used in the first movie, I believe, if I'm remembering that correctly. But this is the only time we had actually seen Pikachu come out of its Pokeball in the actual series, which is it's a nice little bit of trivia. So Ash picks up Pikachu and hugs it. However, Pikachu doesn't like being hugged and gives Ash a massive electric shock, as Oak explains that Pikachu is an electric type and has a shocking personality to match. Oak gives Ash some Pokeballs and a Pokedex. However, at this point, Pikachu shocks them both. Heading outside, Ash finds that his mother and a small group of supporters outside are ready to wish him luck as he heads out on his Pokemon journey. Ash's mum gets kind of weepy at the thought of her son finally leaving to start his life as a trainer, and she gives him a list of the numerous supplies that she's packed for him before noticing that Pikachu isn't inside its Pokeball, and she kind of asks, what's the go with this? Aren't Pokemon supposed to be in the Pokeball? Ash realizes that she's right and tells Pikachu to get inside, but Pikachu refuses, constantly batting the ball away as Ash throws it towards him. Ash's mum simply assumes that the two are playing, but she kind of admits that Pikachu is a little weird. Pikachu doesn't take kindly to this comment though and shocks everyone in the area except Professor Oak, who remarks that the rubber gloves that his mother packed will come in handy since rubber doesn't conduct electricity. So we've got our first dub change here. In the Japanese version, after being shocked by Pikachu, Delia Ketchum tells Ash to change into his pajamas before going to sleep, even if it's the dirty pajamas he was wearing at the moment. The dub changes this to her telling Ash to remember to change his underwear every single day, which I assume this was kind of changed to make it funnier. The pajamas line, I imagine, as translated, it wouldn't be funny at all, but then change your underwear, that'll give kids a bit of a kick, which it's kind of a lame joke now, but I could imagine back when I was a kid, I probably would have been like, oh, that's funny. So it's a very inconsequential dub change. Ash and Pikachu begin their long journey walking beyond the outskirts of Pallet Town, or rather Ash is kind of just dragging Pikachu along, who's tied to a kind of clothesline leash, and he's wearing his rubber gloves so he doesn't get electrocuted. Ash tries talking to Pikachu, but all he learns is that Pokemon can only say their name, and Pikachu doesn't like him at all. Trying to persuade Pikachu to go inside its Pokeball, Ash consults the Pokedex, but it confirms that while many Pokemon do travel in Pokeballs, and it's usually the norm, some Pokemon actually don't like being confined. Deciding to try and make life easier for Pikachu, Ash removes the leash and rubber gloves, but Pikachu still isn't impressed with him. So at this point, I'm really intrigued why Pikachu hates Ash so much to begin the journey, and I'm not sure if that backstory has ever been properly explained. I've only really watched through the Unova arc, so I mean it could have been explained in Kalos or Alola, but as far as I know, they haven't really ever explained why Pikachu is so mad at Ash at the start. I kind of just imagine that it doesn't respect a rookie trainer like Ash, similar to Charizard and how Charizard treats Ash later on. So yeah, that's kind of how I try to hand-wave this away. So just then, the two hear footsteps behind them and find they're close to a Pidgey. Ash looks up Pidgey in the Pokedex and finds that the small bird is a flying-type Pokemon, which is gentle, easy to catch, and generally a pretty good choice for a beginner trainer to go after. We have an error here though. In the Japanese version, the Pokedex misidentifies Pidgey as the sky Pokemon instead of the tiny bird Pokemon, which is an error you don't really see that often in the Japanese version. Ash is happy at the chance to test Pikachu's skills and tries to send it into battle, but Pikachu refuses, instead deciding to climb a tree and watch. Ash, angry at Pikachu's continuing disobedience, decides to do it himself and throws a Pokeball at Pidgey. The ball actually connects and Pidgey is drawn inside, leading Ash to think that he's captured it. However, the Pokeball shakes for a few seconds before Pidgey escapes, and the Pokedex explains that when catching a Pokemon, you normally have to get your own Pokemon to battle it and weaken it so you can, have a greater chance of catching it. Pikachu finds Ash's ineptitude hilarious, while Ash gets more worked up, determined to show Pikachu what he can do. He decides to try sneaking up on Pidgey with his pajama shirt, but when he covers it, the Pokemon unleashes its gust and sand attacks in response. Ash is sent crashing to the ground and Pidgey flies away. As Ash bemoans his bad luck, he then notices another Pokemon rifling through his bag. He chases it away as the Pokedex identifies it as Rattata, a normal-type Pokemon that lives in the forest generally. When Ash states that they're not in a forest, the Pokedex goes on to explain that occasionally Rattata will emerge to steal food from stupid travelers.
Yeah, but this isn't a forest. It's an open field.
It also comes out into open fields to steal food from stupid travelers.
That means I'm stupid?
So Dexter is so sassy here. You don't get that later on. I would have loved to have seen it maintain this kind of personality through the entire region. I guess the whole having two gym leaders travel with Ash kind of negates the need to be always going back to the Pokedex to consult it. But I feel like they could have created some hilarious moments if they kept having the personality that Dexter had in this first episode. I don't know if it actually has much personality after this episode. So, yeah, I don't know. It could have been a fun running gag. And I know they have the Rotom Dex in the Alola region at the moment. And this is kind of a precursor to having a Pokedex with a full-on personality. And, I think it would have been a nice addition to this first season. As Pikachu laughs further, Ash notices some more Pidgey nearby and throws a stone at them in frustration. Just then he spots what he thinks is a lone Pidgey nearby and is determined to finally catch this one. He throws another stone and it makes a direct hit, only it turns out not to be a Pidgey, but instead is a much angrier looking bird-type Pokemon. Ash scans it with his Pokedex and it identifies the bird as Spearow, which, unlike Pidgey, has a pretty bad attitude and a violent temperament, being known for attacking people and Pokemon without warning, so basically the complete opposite of the Pidgey that he was trying to catch. Ash then sees Spearow flying directly at him. However, as it passes, Spearow spots Pikachu in the tree and decides to attack him instead. The Pokedex explains that wild Pokemon are sometimes jealous of those with trainers, and as Ash tries to get Spearow to focus on him again, Spearow nearly knocks Pikachu out of the tree, and at this point, Pikachu unleashes its electricity attack, which sends Spearow falling to the ground. So Pikachu's kind of had enough and decided to actually kind of throw its weight around here. A bit of trivia, this episode reveals that Spearow see in black and white, which is such a random piece of trivia, but yeah, it's something that we learned from this episode. So Spearow is down from the electric attack, but it's not out and lets out a loud cry. In the distance, Ash and Pikachu spot a huge flock of Spearow emerging from a tree, and they're heading straight towards Ash and Pikachu. The two decide to make a run for it and quickly try to get away as the furious flock gives chase. Ash promises Pikachu that he will protect him. However, Pikachu runs on ahead of Ash, which makes it an easy target for Spearow, since they're not going to hesitate at just absolutely going in on Pikachu. By the time Ash is actually able to reach Pikachu, it's quite weak and can no longer run. So Ash picks up the Pokemon and carries it away. The two come to a fast-flowing river, and Ash, needing to get away from the still angry Spearow, quickly jumps in and allows himself and Pikachu to be swept away, during which he very nearly gets eaten by a Gyarados. There's so many different tribes of Pokemon in this little section here that kind of pop up out of bushes and the like. And I think kind of little touches like that, they make the whole world feel so much more alive, and you feel like this truly is a Pokemon world where, you're just going to see Pokemon going about their lives, and not just when the plot demands for Ash to run into one, which just, as a child, again, it kind of latched onto that sense of wonder that Pokemon gives you, and just, I don't know, it's something so great about seeing such a little touch. It's something you don't get as much from the games. Outside of encountering them in battle, you don't really come across them in the overworld too often. I know this has kind of changed with the release of Let's Go, Pikachu and Eevee, where you're actually running into them in the overworld and you can kind of see them in this format that they're in the anime, which I like. But yeah, previously until then, you really didn't get that sense that the world was alive and full of Pokemon, just in the bushes, in the trees, in their natural habitats. But back to the plot here. Further down the river, where there's no current, a young girl is enjoying a leisurely fish when her lure starts to react. The girl quickly grabs onto her rod and reels in what she thinks is probably a huge Pokemon, but instead, to her disappointment, she yanks out Ash and Pikachu. She's disappointed with this, but then notices that Pikachu's in pretty bad shape and tells Ash angrily that he should never let a Pokemon get to this condition. She tells him that Pikachu needs to get treatment right away and that there's a Pokemon Center pretty close by.
Hey, I got a bite! Oh, wow, I really think this could be a big one! Nah, it's just a kid. Oh, and a Pokemon! Oh, are you okay?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Not you! Look what you've done to that poor little thing! Is it breathing?
I think so.
There's actually a relatively large dub change here, and the first time we see 4 kids having to censor the show, in the Japanese version, after Ash thanks Misty, she slaps him. This is obviously cut from the dub. The screen literally just freezes as Ash answers one of Misty's questions. And obviously, this was cut due to the physical violence of the whole scene, which it's really not that bad. And I feel like they probably get away with stuff like this later on. And I think other shows of like similar, in a similar vein, like targeting a similar audience, do probably much worse things. But I can imagine that being the first episode, the people in charge of the dub were like, this is a bit borderline. We probably don't want in our first episode to, piss off the wrong kind of overprotective parents who end up calling in and being like, why are you showing this kids program with such excessive violence? So I can understand why it was cut in this first episode. Ash is clearly seen in the dub rubbing his aching face after the slap, and Misty has her hand in the air, but I mean, it's noticeable if you look for it, but if you're just watching the episode, it kind of, I feel like it kind of goes by a little bit unnoticed. Like, it's not a huge gaping error, considering they took out a relatively significant shot. So, yeah, I can't complain too much with how they edited around that. So as Misty points out the direction Ash needs to go, he notices that the flock of Spearow has somehow caught up. Ash decides to make a getaway on the girl's bike and puts Pikachu in the front basket. Despite Misty's protests and promise, he still jets on it. He promises that he'll eventually give it back, but this does nothing to quell her anger. As Ash rides for dear life, a thunderstorm starts. With rain falling and the Spearow flock still on his tail, Ash rides as fast as he can. However, the Spearow catch up and start to attack him, and this, coupled with the dangerous conditions, eventually cause Ash to fly off a small bank, crashing to the ground. Lying in the mud, Ash spots Pikachu nearby and weaker than ever. Upset that his first day as a Pokemon trainer has turned into such a disaster, Ash tells Pikachu to get inside his Pokeball, as it seems to be the only way he can be safe from the approaching Spearow. Deciding he's done running, Ash stands before the Spearow and announces that he refuses to be beaten by the likes of them if he's going to be a Pokemon Master, vowing to defeat them all.
Spearows, do you know who I am? I'm Ash from the town of Pallet. I'm destined to be the world's #1 Pokemon Master. I can't be defeated by the likes of you.
So a little error here. When Ash stands up to the Spearow to protect Pikachu, he incorrectly refers to them as Spearows. The plural of a specific species of Pokemon is just the same as the singular, so it should just be Spearow rather than Spearows, which is an error that uninformed people and many parents at the time would make, often referring to Pokemon as Pokemons. They're like, oh, my son's got heaps of Pokemons, where it's just singular, and it always was just a perfect little tick to let you know that this person has no idea what they're talking about. So when Pokemon really kicked off and people were talking about it being bad for kids and being satanic and stuff, and when they'd refer to it as Pokemons, you'd be like, yep, you haven't really interacted with the series at all. I'm gonna not listen to a single thing you're saying because you're probably just a weird overprotective nutter. But yeah, it's not really a big deal, to be honest. Pikachu then sees that Ash is willing to sacrifice himself and save Pikachu. Just before the Spearow flock can hit, Pikachu jumps onto Ash's shoulder and then into the air. Pikachu is struck by lightning, causing him to let out a massive thunder shock, which throws Ash back onto the ground. The decision to set this scene during a thunderstorm, I think, really pays off. It obviously pays off in the plot, but pays off in a visual and kind of cinematic way. There are so many really nice looking shots here with the rain pouring down and the lightning flashes, and it always looks like such an epic moment when they flash back to it. And in the Pokemon I Choose You movie, it's even more epic because obviously you've got the benefit of animation in 2019 and it being in high definition. So, but the original idea to set it during the thunderstorm, it just pays off so beautifully. I love this whole sequence. Soon, the rain clears and the sun starts shining. Ash and Pikachu are lying unconscious near the smouldering remains of the bike they stole. The two wake up and find the Spearow flock has gone, and the two weakly note that despite everything, they managed to defeat their attackers together, and finally a friendship is kind of formed between the two. Just then, a shimmering gold Pokemon flies overhead towards a rainbow. Ash wonders what it was, and the Pokédex can't even identify it, but explains that there are many Pokemon species yet to be discovered.
What's that?
There is no data. There are still Pokemon yet to be identified.
So, obviously, I thought Ho-Ho's appearance here was the coolest thing. I always have. It's such a nice little nod to the future. And the message from the Pokédex about there always being more species to be discovered is a cool little nod towards and kind of future-proofing the series rather than them being like, oh, every Pokemon has been discovered, and then when Johto rolls around, they're like, oh, it's not there. You kind of have to suspend your disbelief considering Johto is literally next door to Kanto and they would know about these Pokemon. Maybe not Ho-Oh necessarily, even though it's in Legends. Maybe people have just literally written it off as that, a legend. But yeah, you kind of have to be like, yeah, your Pokédex probably should know about most Johto Pokemon, but, again, Pokemon logic. It's actually a little shocking that it was able to be shown this early, Ho-Ho that is. The episode aired in Japan on April 1st, 1997, as I mentioned earlier, and Gold and Silver didn't release until November 21, 1999, and I think it's pretty much been confirmed at this point. I don't know if it's been legitimately confirmed. I think it has, but don't quote me on that Ho-Ho was planned for Red and Blue initially. I'm pretty sure 190 Pokemon were planned for Red and Blue, but Game Freak pushed the Game Boy carts to the limit. They basically maxed it out, as far as I know, and the only reason they could fit Mew in and get 151st Pokemon is because they removed the debug mode, and that freed up 300 bytes of space, which allowed them to slot in Mew. So they obviously weren't going to fit in 40 other Pokemon, but yeah, Ho-Ho was definitely planned a lot earlier than it was first officially introduced. And it's really cool that they used Ho-Ho there. They must have been communicating with Game Freak a lot at the time, because obviously just, the people running the show probably aren't privy to Ho-Oh being a thing necessarily. Game Freak would have had it in their design docs and stuff. There would have been sketches and concept art, but I don't necessarily think, when creating the anime, the people in charge of it would have been, getting access to unreleased Pokemon. So I think it's overall it's pretty cool to have Ho-Oh there, and it kind of evokes that sense of wonder. This is such a vast, ever-changing, and kind of mysterious world. So after watching the Pokemon disappear into the distance, Ash picks up Pikachu and keeps on walking as the narrator explains that Ash and Pikachu have many more adventures together to come. Reaching a bank, Ash spots Viridian City in the distance and heads toward it, having taken the first of many steps on his Pokemon journey. We then, after the episode, get the Poke Rap, which, I mean, just a genius way to introduce kids to all the Pokemon. Imagine the Pokemon has not debuted yet. There are 151 Pokemon for you to learn right off the bat. The games have not hit yet, so I mean, I'm watching it. I have no idea what any of these Pokemon are. So hitting them with a really catchy Poke Rap is the perfect way to do it because, I mean, kids are naturally going to want to like try to learn it and sing along with it, and as a result, that creates familiarity with the Pokemon. And breaking it up into little chunks like they did, they would do, section by section, was pretty smart too. If you just like throw in the entire Poke Rap, it'll just be like, yep, I'm gonna have to watch like 100 episodes before I get this. But doing it in smaller chunks is a little bit easier for kids to kind of wrap their heads around. That does us for the actual episode summary and discussion. It's time for my thoughts on the actual quality of the episode. Personally, I think this is a great episode, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a lot of people who don't like it. I mean, a lot of it is due to nostalgia, but if you do look at it critically as, without the nostalgia goggles on, it does stand up as a pretty great episode. It's a solid introduction to both Ash and Pikachu. We get a very clear understanding of what their relationship together is like. They're frosty, and they have this shared experience which actually makes them bond together, which I really like. They could have gone the much blander route of just being like, he gets Pikachu and they're best buds already, and they're just there's no reason for them to actually be best buds, but Ash just apparently has an innate ability to be best friends with a Pokemon. Actually having them, actually having the development there, having Ash sacrifice himself, showing Pikachu that he really does care for Pikachu, despite Pikachu being a dick to him the entire time they've known each other. It's just, I think it's a great bit of writing. We also get small glimpses into Gary being the rival, as well as teasing Misty's continued appearance on the show, and I feel like it doesn't overload the viewer with too much information by doing this. Like, we don't go too much into Gary, we don't go too much into Misty, we don't even get Team Rocket, so I think they kind of drip feed enough information to get the viewer hooked, and it intrigues you, gets you interested, and then you want to see what happens next. And as it progresses, we can introduce Misty, we can introduce Team Rocket, we can introduce Brock, we can kind of further grow Gary's character, and introduce all the other aspects of Pokemon. You really don't learn that much about the Pokemon world in this episode. You learn that you want to be a Pokemon master if you're a Pokemon trainer, and that they're setting off on this journey that you can catch Pokemon. But correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think gyms are actually ever mentioned in this episode. And like, you obviously get the shot of the huge battle in the stadium, so battling's a thing, but you could genuinely think, watching this first episode, like, oh yeah, you train up your Pokemon and stuff, but like, maybe you enter tournaments, that's what you do. Like, you don't have a clear understanding of what Ash is going to do, and then they kind of drip feed you that through the next episodes. They teach you what gyms are, you'll find out what the Pokemon League is, which I think is a really smart idea, and it kind of prevents any of the early episodes from being devoid of important plot developments, and there's not a lot of filler early in this arc, because they instead of just doing a big info dump, they spread it out pretty evenly. But yeah, that's my thoughts on the episode. I thought it was, I'll call it great. I don't know if it's the best episode, not even in this season, but it's a really good place to start, and I can't fault them too much here. Before we move on, here's a recap of the major events that occur in this episode. Ash and Gary begin their Pokemon journeys. Gary starts his journey with a Squirtle, which we obviously don't learn until later. Ash starts his journey with a disobedient Pikachu, a Pokedex, and 6 Pokeballs. Ash fails to catch a Pidgey. Ash meets Misty. Ash steals Misty's bike and destroys it when Pikachu defeats a flock of Spearow. Ash and Pikachu become friends. Ash sees a mysterious Pokemon in the sky. And Ash reaches Viridian City. And before I move on to the next section of the podcast, I want to keep a running tally of Ash Ketchum's win-loss record in battles against trainers. I think it'll be kind of interesting to see how he fares overall in his journeys. People like to give him a lot of shit, so I want to kind of keep track of that. I think it'll be also interesting to keep track season by season how well he's doing, and region by region. I want to see if his win-loss record in Kanto is worse than the one in Johto, and then that Johto is worse than Hoenn, and then, see if there's a subtle amount of improving Ash's competency. There's a lot of talk about, he just resets all the time. But I don't know. I don't know if that's necessarily true and reflected in his win-loss record. Obviously, they reset his kind of skill level in Unova. It's a bit of a soft reset in those seasons. But up to then, I think it'll be interesting to look at. But moving on from that, obviously we don't have anything to update on his win-loss record. It's 0-0 at the moment, and he doesn't have an actual trainer battle for a while. We've got the trivia section, and I want to bring you little tidbits of info and, little bits of information that can enrich your knowledge of the anime. So, despite this episode centering around receiving a starter Pokemon, neither Bulbasaur, Charmander, or Squirtle actually appear in the flesh until Bulbasaur in the Hidden Village, Charmander the Stray Pokemon, and Here Comes the Squirtle Squad respectively. This is actually unlike the following generations, where at least one of the starter Pokemon appears in the first episode of every new generation, which it's actually, when I found that out, I was like, oh wow, I didn't realize that. We also have this being one of the very few episodes in which Rachel Lillis provides the voice of Pikachu in a few scenes of the dub. This happened when another Japanese voice actor spoke over the Japanese voice actor for Pikachu, and the audio couldn't be used, so their hand was forced to have Rachel Lillis do the voice, because obviously if you just keep it as it is, keep Pikachu's voice as it is, there's going to be a random Japanese voice, and it's probably going to be a little bit weird and off-putting. Only 2 pieces of background music were kept in the dub here. The opening music of Red and Green in the beginning, and Tears After the Cloudy Weather, which is in the scene where Ash is defending Pikachu from the Spearow. So 4Kids did a lot of chopping and changing of the soundtrack, which I still don't exactly know why they did that. It's just music, nothing, just because it was in the original, sorry. I don't know, it's music, it translates over perfectly. Music is the universal language. I don't know why it needed to be changed. Maybe, I guess, they wanted to change the tone of the show a lot. But yeah, if you know why 4Kids was so keen to change background music, I think they do it in most of their dubs. If you know the reason why, please sound off in the comments below on the YouTube video. Because I would love to find out. Our final bit of trivia is that this is the only episode of the original series in which the Team Rocket trio does not appear. The next time there's an episode that features 0 seconds of Team Rocket is actually 672 episodes later. That's in the episode Rematch at the Nacrene Gym, which is a Unova arc episode, and Team Rocket are they're quite different in Unova. If you haven't watched that season, they adopt a more serious tone for the first half of the season, which eventually gets dropped. And I actually really liked that serious tone, but with that serious tone, it meant they weren't popping up every episode with a new scheme. They still appeared in the majority of episodes, which is why it took until the Rematch at the Nacrene Gym episode for them to be absent. They would still, usually at the end of the episode, they would progress their plot a little bit. But yeah, they weren't as featured as we'll soon find out in the coming episodes. They also technically didn't appear in a clip show episode, which was the 120 the 120th episode, of the Advanced Generation series. But this episode was never aired outside of Japan, which is the case for all of the clip show episodes, because clip shows really, they're not really a thing they were a bit of a thing previously, but by the late 90s, I think clip shows had kind of started going away, particularly as people could start taping episodes on like VHS, so it wasn't as necessary to, and it kind of became redundant to package a clip show together and be like, oh, we're showing them all these things that they've probably only seen once or twice. There's actually no extra errors or dub changes of note in this episode. They all got addressed at their specific time throughout the episode, which means we're moving on to the Pokemail segment of the show. Now, each week I want to propose a question of the week to the audience that you can respond to by going to the YouTube video of this episode and just typing in the comments below, and I'll read them out on the next week's episode, or the next episode, sorry. This week's question, I'm just going to keep it pretty simple. What's your fondest memory of watching the original generation of the anime? I have so many fond memories of watching the original generation of the anime, and just for this sake, I'm counting original generation is up until Hoenn, so it can be Johto as well. And actually, I don't have many memories of watching Kanto. Like, I strain my memory, and I legitimately can't remember sitting down and watching Kanto. I 100% would have been watching it at the time, but yeah, I don't have any memories. I was probably a bit too young for having actual concrete memories about that. I do have quite a few memories of watching Johto though, and I distinctly remember my nan would always tape the episodes, because on school holidays I would sleep in and end up missing the episodes that would air at like 7 a.m. So she would tape them, and one episode she taped was the gym battle with Faulkner. No, is it Faulkner? Yeah. I'm drawing a blank. The Violet City Gym. I think it's Faulkner. But no, it's I can't believe I'm blanking on this. I've watched that episode literally hundreds of times because my nan taped it and I would watch it over and over again. But yeah, watching that episode is probably one of my fondest memories of the anime, and I want to find out what the fondest memories you have of the original generation. But that basically brings us to the end of this episode. Thanks for listening to Who's That Pokemon. I really hope you enjoyed the debut episode of the show. If you're not already subscribed to this podcast, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, and pretty much any podcast service. Hopefully I'll have all of those actually up by the time this episode goes up. Some of those services like Spotify, you can only submit to Spotify once you have 5 episodes published, so that probably won't be up at the moment, but I should have all the other podcast services ready to go. But if one of them happens to not be up, feel free to send me a message and I'll get on that. You can also find the show on Twitter. The handle for the show is at Who's That PKMN Pod. Couldn't fit in Who's That Pokemon Pod, so I had to shorten Pokemon there. You can also follow me on Twitter as @SourceMarlow, and that brings us to the end of the show. That's all for this episode. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is a twice weekly show, so 2 episodes coming at you each week, each Wednesday and Sunday. So on Sunday, keep your eyes peeled to whatever service you watch or listen on to get a new episode. I hope you join me for that next episode, because I'll be looking back at Pokemon Emergency, which is actually another pretty big episode for the show. But that does it for now. I will see you guys later.